To start, we have two distinguished guests tonight, both from the States. A second-generation American, Julian Bonder, and guess what? Next-generation American, Vilnius. And both of them complement each other very fruitfully, I would say, because Julian is a practitioner, is an architect, and a public speaker on the subject of memorials, commemoration, public spaces in relation to social activism. And he will be talking about that briefly. While Gediminas is a well-known and here very known between us social and cultural critic who is observing the produce that architects are putting up and responding to that artistically with his performance and project work. So both of them will hopefully complement each other and will get 2 out of 1 this night. So first, what we'll do, Julian will give a talk about 50-55 minutes with some slides to accompany, while Gediminas will respond 15-20 minutes with some remarks and maybe some insights coming from his background. And then after that, we'll take questions from the audience, some of you, because lots of you gathered, and I think most of you will want to ask some questions. So we'll try to gather questions in some thematic packets, and then you will address them. Now, very briefly about the two biographically, because I'll have to do that due to them. Julian Bonder is teaching architecture at Roger Williams University and lives and works in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Gediminas is based, as you know, perhaps most of you, is now based also in Massachusetts. He's an associate professor at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So both of them have been known to be not just architects, artists, but social activists. And both of them wanted more from the public space, just a place where you come in and you obey to certain traditions imposed by that place. And this country, in particular, is abound with monuments. We call it Mary's country. Is abound with monuments which invite us to obey certain traditions and be part of the traditions that we don't know, we won't want to be. And when I was considering your monument, and the latest monument that Julian will present tonight, the monument that you erected together with the Polish architect in Nantes, the memorial to the abolition of slavery, I was thinking, what a nice thing to have here in Lithuania, memorials which would commemorate, for example, 8-hour working day, commemorate women's right to vote, commemorate gay rights to parade, commemorate valuable and ideologically valuable moments, not to be just pursuers of tradition. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to Julian Bonder. Julian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome and for the introduction. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here with you, and I'd like to begin by saying that I'm very moved to be here in Lithuania for various reasons. You know, among them, to be in the company, you know, for a couple of days of my dear friends Nomeda and Gediminas Urbonas, who I've admired their work for a very long time, and the opportunity to visit very shortly Vilnius and visit Kaunas and see a place that was always in my imagination. Because I had a former design partner, colleague architect who studied together with me architecture in Buenos Aires, whose name was Litvak. You know, his family came from here. So that's one reason. But the other reason as well is that I learned, you know, a lot about the struggle to, you know, gain independence and gain democracy, you know, and try to sort of enact new forms of of how we understand ourselves in the world. You know, I think it's quite significant for me to be here and learn from you. And the third thing that is also important is that, as you will see during the presentation, I have a strong connection to a certain philosophical tradition that is a kind of a bit of a humanist tradition, but it's also based on the question about ethics, let's say, and that comes from, in part, let's say, from life, but it's also part, you know, to the writings of Emmanuel Levinas, who was a philosopher born in Kaunas, as many of you may know, in 1906, and wrote eloquently about this idea of ethics and who's the other, and how do we think about others. So that's somehow what I try to think when I think of buildings. And I tried during this presentation to unfold some of those ideas, let's say. The presentation will have two basic parts. You know, if you can imagine, there will be about 20-something minutes, you know, in which there will be lots of images going very quickly. I will not speak about the images very much. They will serve somehow as a background to some of the concepts that I'd like to share with you, you know, about memory, ethics, public space, traumatic histories, democracy. It will be very packed, but, you know, we'll try to unfold it, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. The second part, which will be woven into the first part, is kind of a more specific presentation about the memorial to the abolition of slavery in France that we just opened about a year ago. Not we, the city of Nantes opened about a year ago. But I also want to mention that that in doing some of the work and doing some of the presentations, I'm also joined by my dear friend, you know, and colleague and partner in design, Krzysztof Wodiczko, you know, Polish artist who, you know, is also mentored to Vilnius and Manila for quite some time. So it's a kind of a series of connections that I wanted to share with you as a beginning. But let me also say that I've been committed through a certain time to investigate or to look at the questions of memory and public space. You know, the relations between public trauma, public space interest me. And I'll share, you know, this time to unfold some of these. The first thing that I'd like to share with you is this concept that the act of remembrance is in and of the present and its references in the past. Which means that memory, as I understand, as many other people understand, is an action. The act of remembering is not an object. Is a moment in time. Is the moment in which we evoke, or as a collective or as individuals, we evoke something that is significant. So it's an action in the present. The reference may be in the past. And I want to say one word. Cake. What comes to your mind? Eating cake, but perhaps a specific cake, you know, that triggers, oh, now I'm hungry and I need to eat cake, right? But perhaps comes from the memories that are evoked by that word, or the smells when you go in front of a bakery and you remember the cookies that were baked at your house, you know, through, you know, when your grandmother was doing that, you know. Do you remember these kinds of things all the time? Smell, visuals, you know, places that also capture our imagination, and also places who have what we can call very difficult histories, you know, very difficult grounds, you know, very difficult to understand, as I will explain later. But also there's a fact that memory is selective, you know. This is a very short quote by an Argentinian author, where I come from, Jorge Luis Borges, who wrote in one of his fantastic short stories called Funes el Memorioso, that is Funes the Memorious. You know, he wrote about a man who remembered absolutely everything that was in the world. So if he was drinking wine, he would remember the grapes that were in the vine from where that wine came from. So you can imagine, can you remember everything? No, it needs to be selective. It's related, it's connected between, kind of a dialectic connection between forgetting and remembering. So what I think we need to try to do is to put sort of somehow memory to use. Nietzsche was talking about productive forgetting, back when, perhaps we need to have productive remembering as an idea. What is what we remember? Perhaps, as you were saying, can we think about, these moments in history that are significant to us? Well, how next generations will remember those moments? Perhaps they don't. Well, we'll see. But there's also a fact that I'm thinking about this idea of memory in action, not memory as not as an object, memory as a verb. And to remember is to be present, is to say here we are, remembering collectively, remembering individually, And to be present is to consider, and I think it's important in the context of this conversation, is to consider our work as academics, as artists, as philosophers, historians, as public intellectuals, as a place in which we can seek the truth, we can talk truth, we can speak honestly about this, fearless speaking. But we need to speak about an ongoing plight, and these are images of the project in France, and you will see many. Am I covering so you can see? Let me move a little bit so you can see better. Is this better? So, what I'm trying to say is that as professionals in any kind of fields, we need to be able to speak truth. And to speak truth is in a certain way to look at each other and to try to understand what is this? What is to speak in public? What does it mean for public space to hear the voices of those who never were able to speak? Because we need to continue to speak against this situation. According to the UN, there's about 27 million people today in slavery. There's also more than 500,000 women trafficked every year for the purpose of sex slavery. So, what do we do about this? These are part of the questions about memory. It's not just remembering the past, it's actually allowing the past to demand from us to become better people, better humanity, better cultures, better societies. Some of the work that I do with my students connect to the story of Rhode Island, small state in America, which was the largest slave trade state, and nobody knows about it, because we think slavery, United States, the South. Is that true? Is that so? Well, we don't know, but there's a kind of a connectedness that has to do with the economic foundation of the United States that is related to the wealth of the North. So how do we do that? How do we think about it? But there's something else that I want to share with you in this idea of remembering and being part of society, which is, again, following Emmanuel Levinas in the fantastic book, very, very significant book called La difficile liberté in French. I don't know if he wrote that book in Lithuanian. I think he wrote in French. But he says, society is the miracle of moving out of oneself. And to me, this is a key thing as an architect. We work, and I work as architect and collaborating as an artist, for and with others. None of this work is about us, is about ourselves. It's about something else, something larger. So in a certain way, I'm thinking about that kind of commitment, and to think about new institutions, as you just mentioned a second ago. New institutions of commemoration that are not, again, just looking at the past, but looking at the present. Because memorials could be thought of as ethical and political companions, psycho-political companions. That is, can they be places where that kind of environments for thinking that encourage new critical consciousness and makes us see the world in different ways? That's part of the idea. There is the notion, or a word that I like always to use, and this is why the talk is called Memory Works, which has to do with this idea of memory, the work of memory. There's an intellectual effort in remembering, the effort of becoming intellectual, but also the effort of recall, as Henri Bergson told us long time ago, has to do with that. Think of this. Every morning you wake up, you stretch, perhaps not, but you stretch, you go to the bathroom, you wash your teeth, you comb, maybe you paint your face or whatever, you go out. What would happen if you didn't remember how to stretch? What would happen if you had to learn every day, once again, everything you know? There are aspects of memory, and we know amnesia, and we have looked at that, and we know that there are people who have this very difficult conditioning of of illnesses related to memory. Well, think about this. There's an aspect that is habit, you know. We move our fingers, we move our hands, we eat. But there's another thing which has to do with the capacity of evoking and recalling. And I think that spaces can do that, can help us do that, not can do that for us, can help us do that. And that's why, you know, what we think in the project, you know, at Nantes, that's part of the idea. Because, and I'll show you quickly a couple of things that you will see repeated, you know, the project in France, an underground space, Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies that I designed a while ago, you know, I'll show you a little bit later, or a project for the Holocaust Museum in Buenos Aires, which basically is a transformation of an existing space, or the memorial to September 11 in New Jersey, and the window, and you will see it many times, in Nantes, an underground space that looks at the Palace of Justice across the river. I'll explain the project a bit later, but just, you will see these images various times. But remembering is a vital activity and shapes our relation with the past and defines our present and future. Memories are selective. Memories are always imperfect and they are always subject to distortions. They are constructed. Since the 80s, we know that Western societies have developed an obsessive pursuit of memory. And in its many forms, memory has impacted all the kinds of things that you know. You know, from cinema, to studies, to art, to culture, to psychoanalysis, you know, to computer science. Who has a computer? Who has a computer here? Who has an iPhone? Or whatever. No, maybe not an iPhone. That's the advertisement, so no. So, if your computer stores stuff, you know, it's based on how much memory, how much stuff can it hold? Who has here a collection of images of probably 10,000? Yeah, 5,000. I'm just now betting. You know. Come on. How many times have you seen those images? Very few. But they are there, right? So we think of memory as well, you know, as kind of a repository of things that we can access. But we will talk about the difficulty of accessing memory in a little bit. So, phone. So, we're talking about the relation between landscape and architecture, landscape and memory. But an important aspect of this obsessive pursuit, perhaps, is the way that the struggle for justice and human rights, you know, and remembrance of traumatic events have been coupled. You know. There's remembrance and there's also that idea, and that is also judicial. And you have seen it here in Lithuania, we have seen it in Argentina, we have seen it, these photos from Peru, from the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation. You know, so we have seen that idea, that memory and the idea of nation, you know, but not just in the sense of, you know, kind of a only identity. I'm not talking about the connection between memory and identity, but I'm talking about the idea that memory has been used and many times abused, but I would like not to put irony in my words. I hope you don't hear any kind of irony in my words because I don't come from that place, let's say. It comes from an open heart to think about the value of memory in culture and in society. But we have seen that societies relate to memory when they think about, you know, when they try to perfect their own democratic life in the wake of mass extermination, slavery, apartheid, segregation, genocide, you know, the Holocaust, desaparecidos in Argentina, you know, slavery in Zanzibar, you know, and you can see that totalitarianism is also kind of connected to the issue of memory and how we think about ourselves in the world. So the construction of memorials is significant, not only because of the number, you know, as you said before, there are monuments in every corner and we don't see them, let's say, but they are significant because of what they do for affected communities. This is in Uruguay or in Buenos Aires. People go to these places to think. This is Nantes, you know, but we'll also see, you know, the kind of that there's an emergence both of spontaneous memorials where tragedy occurs, but also pilgrimage to sites of memory, like Auschwitz, you know, or Budapest, or Haiti, or nearby Katyn, you know, in Belarus. You know. And this is an image that I want to just take 1 second, which is an image from my university. This is where I studied, in University of Buenos Aires, Facultad de Arquitectura, you know, University of Faculty of Architecture. This is a banner that sits on the large courtyard, interior courtyard of the school, which is very large, and has about more than 200 colleagues and students and professors who were disappeared by the military dictatorship between 76 and 1983. And this banner is in the center of the space, but you see below a cafe. And I want to emphasize this connection. Yes, we have to continue our life, but yes, we have to remember. Because there is a demand. Yes, we are alive, we have the right to be here, but also the struggle of those who are not has to be there in the same space. And this is an important thing, because it's connected to what I saw myself in Belarus, in Kurapati, which, Nomena Geriminas, told me a lot, and I saw, the kind of genocide museum very close, that this idea that you mark the place where things happen, is very significant. And you mark it most often without names. At least in Belarus was that case. But we also look at histories like, again, Rhode Island, Brown University, slavery and justice. And we also have to look at moments like in Peru, when a widow is looking just as the remains of the body of someone who was murdered by, the Sendero Luminoso group between 1980 and 80 and 2000. More than 80,000 Peruvians were killed in that war. So we need to speak about this, and we need to find ways to allow or to invite the voices of those who need to tell the story to do it in public. But let me expand a little bit this point, because we're talking about the new forms of monuments, and I will get more specific to that. Think about this: when we say this is the public space of the city, more of the times we mean an official monumental space, which, using Walter Benjamin's words, is reserved for the celebration of the history of the victors. The city usually cultivates its memorials and historic landmarks that celebrate the memory of those who have succeeded at the expense of those who have not. And many times it forgets the nameless. It forgets the vanquished. It forgets the victims and witnesses and survivors of today's and yesterday's crimes. This is in Buenos Aires. But the capacity of democracy, and public space is connected to the idea of encouragement and assisting the process of disruption, of the continuity, of the history of victors. This is an important thing to consider. It's not only ideological, and I want to emphasize this, the basis is not ideological, but it's actually human rights. It's all of us. And that requires architectural and artistic means coupled with political, cultural, and spatial. Hannah Arendt suggested that political equality means visibility. Conversely, political inequality and invisibility go hand in hand. But let me go specifically this. This is kind of people in Nantes, looking at the ground. So you start to get a sense of the project. Let me say a couple of words. Christoph Woliczko and myself, have been working on this project in France for a long time, and are not only, a kind of an artistic and an architectural team, let's say, but also were people whose ancestors suffered, genocide and slavery as well. Christoph was born in Poland, in hiding at the time of the Warsaw Ghetto, 1943. His mother was Jewish, in hiding as well. And his father, according to what he told me, part of his life was a war slave. I myself, I'm an Argentinian, also American. I come from a Jewish family. My mother was born in Berlin in 1936, and they were able to escape in 1938. Other part of the family comes from Ukraine, and we don't know, or we know, let's say. But I want to emphasize this. The reason I mentioned these 2 points is to say that none of these autobiographical notes should be used by us or by anybody to somehow to legitimate our work. Our biography does not confer legitimacy. What it does, conversely, rather, through our individual and collective work, we feel obliged to contribute to the visibility of those whose history and memory have been relegated to the margins of visibility. That is, we are obliged by that history to think about suffering of others, to think about the struggle of others. That's to me the basic point of all this work, like the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, or the Memorial to the Abolition of Slavery in France. Again, the visibility of others who did not have the chance to speak. Let me turn quickly to the concept of questions about memorials and monuments. So I'm trying to sort of, you see, it may take a little more, but I'm trying to unfold, a little bit of the concepts behind all this work, so we can understand, at least we can try to understand a bit more clearly what we're trying to do. The monument, according to Alois Riegel, is a human creation in its original sense, with the purpose of keeping single human deeds or events alive in the mind of future generations. But we know that there's nothing more invisible than a monument. And it was Adolf Loos, architect beginning of 20th century, who suggested that only a small part of architecture belongs to art, the sepulchre and the monument. And he said so because there's a kind of an ethical demand, the idea of making us think about something beyond itself. It's not the thing that matters, but it's beyond itself what matters. So in a certain way, if we look at the word itself, monumentum derives from Latin, and that derives from moneo, that means to warn, to remind, to advise. So we can think that monuments are, a quality. Monumentality is a quality. It's a quality that a place or object can have to make us perceive something beyond itself. Their significance has to do with dialogic relation. The character of memorial space is to establish dialogue between act and remembrance. Hence, to work in this kind of work, requires from us to position ourselves in certain different ways, but to understand that these works are not artistic, architectural only, but they are actually indeed moral, ethical, political, and philosophical. You see images of memorials. This is in Buenos Aires, in Uruguay, and in Chile. This is a memorial in France. And words inscribed in the memorial in France, Hiroshima projections by Krzysztof Woliczko. And that's kind of, again, go back to nouns. So you see, the question for us is, how do we position ourselves and how do we understand, the significance of design in public space? Design and action in public space. How can we contribute to elaborate ethical implications of this work? How do we position ourselves as architects, teachers, artists, students, colleagues, public intellectuals, when we think and work on these projects? In order to unfold this idea of positioning, let me say a few words about architecture itself. Architecture is inherently a practical and public art. It is practical insofar that purpose is the driving force. Purpose. It is public art in that the presence of the work of architecture constructs the space for public appearance. That is, constructs the space for us to inhabit. The work of architecture involves poetic organization of matter to form purposeful, inhabitable space. And always occurs as a transformation of topography, be that permanent or temporary. And it always occurs as a dialogue with history. And it always occurs as a dialogue with materials. These are two houses that I did, because I do houses as well. I love doing houses. But what I'm trying to say is that the notion of dialogue that you see here, old and new, it's very significant in our work. Because projects and buildings, while becoming catalysts for the process of memory, they bring forth the depth of continuity, historical continuity. They establish conversations in space and time. Buildings establish conversations in space and time. They permit us to live our lives and to think about memory. Every path, as you see here, makes us recall of the path in the forest that you just went on Sunday. Every door or every gateway to a stone wall make you recall of something else. Every window perhaps gives you an opportunity to see the world. That's what architecture do. Architecture does. But the architect's historical role has been to create a theater for memory and a theory for culture that makes possible to affirm life and contemplate a better future. But while architects and artists, imagine projects and embark in journeys that trace the skin of the earth, that leave traces over the skin of the earth, our work often lies in uncovering and anchoring histories to cities, to sites, and to territories. It is in the face of catastrophe, historic trauma, and human injustices that this role, the architect's and the artist's role, becomes increasingly problematic. I would say first and foremost problematic, complex, and we only hope necessary. Yet, when we work in these kinds of work, both professionally and in academia, we need also to be wary of the expectation of creating instant metaphors and artificial meanings. Example, this photo, of a Jewish person, clearly, being taken, the bystander, and the joy of a Nazi official inflicting damage, wounding the mind and the soul of this person. Well, can this be represented in this way? To me, there's an issue here. There's a problem about representation, artistic means, and how we do this. Because I think, and it's important to think about this, because I know that the question of aesthetics is an important question. What I'm trying to say is that there is a risk here using these kinds of aesthetics that are a pure representation of the suffering, that asks us or demands from us to consider art as a correction of life. Because we assume, or some people assume, that a certain type of repetition of experience in art may repair inherently damaged or difficult experiences. Leo Bersani has said, the catastrophes of history matter much less if they are somehow compensated for in art. This is an important thing for us to consider in the context of the world we live in. Catastrophes of history appear to matter much less if they are somehow compensated for in art. So neither architecture nor art, I think, should attempt to compensate public trauma or mass murder. What we can do through our practices is to establish a dialogic relation with traumatic events and help frame the process towards understanding. That's the space the library at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. It does not represent the horror of the Holocaust, but invites scholars to read in freedom and to think about life and death. In Nantes, we're using the space that existed, and I'll show you more specifically, to frame the presence of words that tell us a story, but also there are moments like this that are unexpected that the project can invite to happen. So for me, it's important to suggest that our work can help frame that process towards understanding, because indeed, to work in these kinds of work requires a persistent attempt to transform the public sphere. Indeed, involves establishing critical frameworks to position ourselves as profoundly engaged witnesses. Profoundly engaged witnesses, and it demands precise dialogic and committed attitudes towards design, towards techniques, towards materials, towards sites of memory, towards history, towards struggle, towards revolution, and towards the presence of others. Those others that, as an enigma of a face that resists possession and can never be fully known and cannot be reduced to content, as Emmanuel Levinas suggested, those others are still waiting for us to give them or to offer an ethical response. Those others who never had the chance to vote, as you were saying before, or to speak in public, or those others who we know will never appear again, because the only remains is a photograph. So what do we do with that, if we can do anything? Yes, we can shy away from this, or we can try to understand and work through these stories. Philosophers like Giorgio Agamben have theorized the position of the witness as the basis of the ethical political relations, insofar as the witness answers to the suffering of others without usurping the place of the other. Again, position ourselves as engaged witnesses, because the witness answers to the suffering of others without usurping the place of the other. Clear, right? We love Simpson, don't get me wrong. Well, I'm not sure you will. It's really fun. But in the context of what we're trying to say, you know, we're trying to think that witnessing is a significant thing. Because it's a way of seeing and listening that requires an acceptance of vulnerability. Witnessing, you know, requires a renunciation to the will to master stories. Because as trauma theorist Kathy Carroll argues, to bear witness to the truth of a suffering over a traumatic event is to bear witness to the event's incomprehensibility. Again, to bear truth to a traumatic event is to bear truth to that event's incomprehensibility. And here's what we're talking about. The Informe Final, that's the final, you know, book from the Committee of Truth and Reconciliation in Lima, Peru, that has this hand and this photograph in the cover. Thousands of pages of testimonies. And yet, perhaps the only thing we can do as a poetic action is to breathe the names of those who are not here. Breathing is what makes us alive, right? And the name is perhaps the only thing that remains. So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to look at and to understand in our work. And this raises important views and questions for design. For example, how we make room for the voices of others to appear in public without attempting to speak for them. What about those who can speak and those who can bear witness and those who cannot? Desaparecidos in Argentina, for example. Or the thousands that happened, what happened in Lithuania. What about those we know will not reappear? But what about those who can still tell us something about the past and makes us think about the future? Such questions suggest a humble approach to our work. And I like to characterize that as ethical deferral. The idea that we defer ethically to others. Yes, we assert the authorship and the presence and the material qualities of the work, yet the work is not about ourselves, as I said before. Because we're trying to create and to frame and illuminate presences through material and absences as well, through materials beyond materiality, through language beyond representation, through space beyond space. That's the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I'm going to go quickly through this so we can get to France. But it's a library, you know, and this is the kind of attitude that I bring to my work and to my teaching. You know, that's what I was telling you the last, 25 or so minutes. You know, we deal with stories, we think of archives, we think of objects, we think of testimonies, we think of empty space for others to speak. We think of materials, and we think of our memories. For example, the World Trade Center, that became the steel pieces, and we were invited to do a project. We won the competition, but I'm not sure if it's going to happen. Which is basically laying these pieces on the ground in a space. So it's always creating spaces for us to see ourselves in the middle of the story. Hoboken, September 11. And I will go to the project in France. But let me just show you a couple of things that have to do with the relation. And I think students, we teach at different universities, and we try to invite students to think about architecture in the context and art in the context of history, in different ways, context of testimonies. So these are maps, that students produce, about the waters of Rhode Island, and various kinds of projects, such as the new museum for Rhode Island slavery. This is just a short thing, but let me go to the project in France in the next 20-something minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a conversation about all this. The project in France, is a very complex project, and it's a very complex at various levels: technically, architecturally, urbanistically, politically, in terms of human rights, and in terms of the difficulty of making such a project that is quite large, is about 400 meters long. I'll show you more specifically, but we tried to conceive of this project as a working memorial. And the reason we say that is that we think that this project should invite the work of memory. And the work of memory is the effort that we have to put when we go to a place to think about it. Remember what I said at the beginning, memory is an action, not an object. So in a certain way, sorry, let me go back to this. This is important. This project provides space and means to remember and think about slavery, commemorate resistance and the abolitionist struggle, engage and celebrates the act of abolition, which is a historic act, and brings the visitor close to present-day forms of slavery. This is key for us, key for the project. The project as an instrument of possible change. The project transforms the city, the landscape. You see here, big embankment. This is half of the length of the project. From here to here is about 200 meters. There's about 200 meters more, along the coast. And that's on the Loire River, on the coast. That's the port where so many ships departed. But let me use the words for a second, of someone who was our client. And I want to emphasize this. Our client was the city of Nantes and was the mayor of the city of Nantes, Monsieur le Maire, who speaks French. Oh, good. Okay, Monsieur le Maire. So, Monsieur le Maire, Jean-Marc Ayrault, was mayor of the city of Nantes for a long time. Elected many times. Basically was also president of the Socialist Party in the National Assembly. Very significant political figure. And he was committed to this project. Through all the hurdles, was committed to have this project realized. With all the challenges, political challenges, which means, think about this, designating about 400 meters of the coast of the Loire River in the center of the city of Nantes to recall the crime of a city. It's a very significant political act. Obviously, the name of the memorial, and we can talk about this, is about celebrating the moment in which that crime is interrupted, because we're talking about abolition. But we cannot talk about abolition if we don't talk about slavery, or we don't talk about slave trade, which was the source, the economic power of Nantes in all Europe. The mayor said, this memorial demonstrates a genuine call to us all to remember past struggles in order to project ourselves into the future, fighting against all modern forms of slavery and denial of human rights in order to build a more united world. He says, by building the memorial on the banks of the Loire, in the heart of a city, and at the point which the slave trading expeditions departed, by giving its monumental artistic form and linked to the balance of justice on the other side of the water, we recall the fact that the struggle for freedom and dignity for all human beings is a fundamental cause inextricably linked to our vision of society. That society, that is the miracle of moving out of oneself, going back and linking Venus to this idea of a political society. This memorial, again, Jean-Marc Ayrault, who's now French Prime Minister, this memorial, which is unique in this scale in Europe, is a message from the people in Nantes that also becomes a living place for collective commitment to continuing our struggle for recognition and promotion of human rights. That's a political declaration, and you will hear him speak in a moment. So the project basically transforms the coast. This is the existing conditions. The big buildings in front in Quai de la Fosse. This was a parking lot, on the surface. And this is the plan of the Loire, and this recalls the historic condition of, sugar barrels coming to the port of Nantes. But this is connected to the story of the slave route. More than 35,000 ships, expeditions departed from Europe to Africa to bring people that were enslaved to the Caribbean colonies, to the Americas, Brazil, and then bring back products that developed Western Europe. So sugar was a key commodity at that time. Nantes had about 46% of all French expeditions. So that's about 2,000 expeditions, meaning from Nantes, about 4,000 expeditions from France. But again, I want to go back to this point. Today, slavery exists, and we need to make sure we understand that our commitment to make a world better will include helping people be free today. Because 500,000 are, for example, 500,000 is, again, and I repeat this because it's very important, are women who are trafficked into every country you can imagine, from every country you can imagine, from borders nearby, and from your own country, and from Argentina, and from the United States. People are taken and they are trafficked. Today, 21st century, we have to do something about it. The memorial takes over the site, as I said before. You know, can you see this is kind of the length? And this building here, can you see that? That's the Palace of Justice by Jean Nouvel. That would be better. So this is the project. This is the site. A site that takes over the totality of that length of the embankment. And the project starts from thinking about this. This is what we found: parking, mud, a diagram that shows, you know, the section, you know. The cut, that is the main gesture of the project, and I will talk in a moment about this. You know, the inhabitation and the transformation of this into inhabitable space. So the project has to do with gestures, you know, yes, evocative and emotional and powerful gestures, you know, and we'll try to kind of confirm the specificity of the site as a responsive site of memory and struggle. Before and after, and this is the plan, and let me just take 1 second to describe a little bit how it works. So this is the site, about 350 meters long. This is the glass that you see emerging to the city. This is about 100 meters long. There are two main entrances. One is here, what we call a monumental stair, and the other one is on the other side. Let me just go back. You see the plan? Yeah. And the other one is here, where there is another staircase and a smaller handicap elevator. And there's an underground, a small exhibition area. You know, here, information center. Here you see the wall of the 19th century embankment that you saw many times, and the pre-existing structure, concrete structure of the 20th century embankment. This is the glass. This is a moment in which the wall was broken, and you can see the Loire River. And this is an important moment in the project because the whole space floods or was flooding every day because of the tides. Imagine this, the Loire River, the change, because it's close to the sea, is about 4 meters daily. So there was a lot of that. And then here is where you see, remember the kind of image that I showed many times, the window that looks at the Palace of Justice? This is where that, you know, window is. And that particular space is where present-day slavery is presented on the glass wall. The glass wall, this is what we found in the space. Sorry, where am I? Yeah. And this is a transformation. This is a 2004 rendering. That means it took a long time to build. From there to there. And this is the moment where people are inhabiting and taking the time to read and to think about this. But this project also started with a sketch, which was trying to find something behind what we saw in the river. So we excavated as a concept. And then we received documents from the city that told us that space existed. So it was an intuition, an interesting question about memory and intuition, about excavation, about the ground that we inhabit, that became the key for the project. So the glass is a significant gesture because it includes, you know, it basically cuts the ground and transforms the city, as you see here. From the other side of the embankment, from the water, and then all the ground is also marked by the presence of these pieces, which suggests the idea that the ground is an archive, a historical archive, that tells the story of French expeditions. There are about 2,000 of those pieces, and people are looking at them. People are trying to find what is what they are reading. They are stopping, they're looking at the ground, and they find things like this. Names of ships, of expeditions. La Thérèse, Navire Négrier, that's slave ship below. L'Amour. Can you imagine a slave ship called L'Amour? But it's there. It's part of the archives. L'Africain. And there are many other names. I'll show you a couple more in a moment. But what is interesting is that people look at the ground and then they start to think, well, there may be something below ground. So the project is a transformation of the space. On the right you see the complete we design, you know, is a texture we design. And this is what we found actually in that space. We had to visit the space, hanging ourselves with harnesses on the current of the river, you know, kind of slippery and dangerous at the same time. I'm not very good with heights, but you know, have to do it. So there's mud, and this mud is transformed into this space. Because this space, remember what I told you about the flooding? Every day there's a change in tides, about 4 meters. So we had to build a dam. You know, imagine constructing a dam under the structure that existed to protect from the water. And this is the space in habitation. So you see what I mean? The spatial conditions were so strong that our task was to do as little as possible, to be as invisible as possible, so that the space itself can bring us to another degree of understanding and of reading. It is a space that does not represent slavery, but rather tries to illuminate the past in order for us to think about the present. A space that sheds light on the history, as a memory sheds light as a lamp on history, yet it requires the action and the presence of people to be meaningful. This is the cut. This is the violent that we're talking about. Because in a certain way, part of the kind of what you could call the conceptual idea as a form is to cut the ground that is implicated in this story as the port of Nantes was. So we cut the ground with this glass. You see, kind of computer rendering. And the glass is basically a vehicle to bring out those texts, 500 years of history, of text, declaration, anti-abolitionist declarations. Toussaint Louverture, avec Grégoire, Vida Equiano, you know. But from the present as well, Toni Morrison, Martin Luther King, Bob Marley, you know, Derek Walcott. You see many texts that are telling us something about, you know, the story. And the glass basically cuts the ground as a gesture. It's 45-degree angles, like this. And when it does that, in a certain way, acts as an interruption. Disrupts the original ground. Remember what I was talking about, the disruption of the presence of the past. But this is also a moment of celebration. And I want to emphasize this. This is a moment of celebration because in a certain way, the fact is both a moment of celebration and of struggle, because the fact that we can celebrate that abolition happened and allows and permits the progress of various races and various kinds of marriages, you know, is connected to the idea of human rights. Because that's the declaration, human declaration at the center of the stair that says, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and slavery shall be prohibited in all their forms. That's a declaration. And it's very significant because the moment you declare, think about this. Have you ever signed a contract? Yes or no? A contract is a declaration, it's an agreement. You know, in its worst, it's lawyers telling you sign here, right? In its best, it's a form of an agreement. It's an agreement, but abolitionist is a declaration that says no more. It's an interruption. It's an interruption of what happened before, the same as the moment of independence. So this glass interrupts the story. And this glass does not reflect. It's a non-reflective glass. It was designed to suggest and to evoke and to be a vehicle for texts, for words. It's very complex construction, and it was studied, you know, first as a reflective glass, and then we understood that the most important thing was actually to kill that reflection so that the letters themselves will carry the meaning. You see? No reflection. Material. And the letters are what carry the meaning. The glass is a gesture, but the letters, the words, the deeds. But this is not possible without hands. Hands of people with care and affection that make this possible. And this is not possible without city officials, what you can say enlightened city officials, and some were very difficult, you know, in terms of budgets and all that, which is very important for architects to think about, you know, and for every kind of line of life to think about where you use your resources. But there were enlightened people who said, we need to do this, and helped us tremendously. People who we don't know, who actually made this project possible, like Hervé Guégan, who was director of the whole project, and suffered tremendously because of the difficulties of construction of this project. Yet, he was committed to do it. The workers, they were committed. As they said many times, I was never committed to do a project as this one, in my life. And they've done ports, and they've done rivers, and they've done lots of stuff. And they were committed to see this through in terms of its construction and in terms of its meaning, so that people can come here and think about the story. The story that relates to the only witness, which is the water. This witness that filters when it rains, because the environment is open, because it marks the idea of revolt with words, because it changes, this, and again, this conditions of a worker that nobody told them, you need to do this. They actually were convinced that it's important to draw the line of each of the stones there to cut the wood precisely. So precision is very important. Precision in the cut, precision in the concept, precision in life, precision in habitation. And the way that this cuts the ground became quite significant. Let me do the one thing, which is to show you a 4-minute video. This is kind of a night view, kind of the lighting of the project, and what happens below ground. Let me show you kind of a quick 4-minute video while we'll start to conclude this part, and then we'll continue with Gediminas, his comments, and all the questions that you may want to ask. I don't have any rush. Let's see if this works. This should go this way. Can you see if the volume is... Yeah, it's maximum. No, put it maximum. Can you hear there? So,
plus de 27 000 expéditions négrières ont été recensées au départ des ports européens entre le XVe et le XIXe siècle. Elles arrachèrent plus de 12,5 millions d'hommes, femmes et enfants à la terre d'Afrique pour les réduire en esclavage en Amérique et aux Antilles. Plus d'1,5 million de personnes moururent pendant la traversée.
So you see the construction, of this work with a purpose of inhabiting it. The city, in a certain way, has turned its architecture to this grand reinscription and, in a certain way, disruptive narrative. The transformation of the space of the city in the middle of the city. And you see the reflection of the water into the city. That happens every morning.
L'esclave de l'esclavage est celui qui ne veut pas savoir. Édouard Glissant.
That was the day of the opening.
La lutte contre toutes les formes d'oppression, d'esclavage, d'exploitation humaine, de discrimination, ça reste un combat d'aujourd'hui. Comprendre notre histoire, comprendre les mécanismes de l'histoire, ça nous donne davantage d'élan, ça nous donne davantage de force pour le faire.
So the project basically transforms the city. And this underground space invites reflection, invites contemplation, invites thinking, and invites action. Invites reading and invites thinking all the time. It takes a long time to be in the space, because it's quite long, and it invites you to do that. Of course.
Nous ne sommes pas tournés vers le passé, nous sommes tournés vers le présent et l'avenir. Et le mémorial est un lieu à la fois pour se souvenir, pour comprendre, mais c'est aussi un lieu pour réfléchir pour aujourd'hui.
Je me dis que c'est horrible, tous les gens qui sont morts dans cette souffrance et les enfants qui sont obligés de travailler.
Je lance ici, de Nantes, aujourd'hui, un appel solennel à tous les citoyens français à lutter sans faiblesse contre toute forme de racisme, d'antisémitisme, contre toute forme d'esclavage et d'exploitation de l'être humain dans le monde.
That's the view of the Palace of Justice on the other side. Derek Walker tells us that the sea is history. And because that's probably the case, is what we try to suggest, that the only witness to the story, the only remaining witness, is the water itself. But let me start to conclude by sharing a couple more images, and then we can have a conversation. I want to share two things with you. Here's what I want to share with you for a second. These pieces on the ground that I was telling you about are this. And because of how they are designed, they invite you to read. This is a day that was raining, but suddenly you move and the text is different. And suddenly you don't see it. And suddenly it's gone. You move and you see it. And the idea here is, again, to invite these groups to participate of this space. They come in freedom, they look at it, different age groups, they collectively gather, and they look at the ground. And this ground tells them a story that they don't know, a story of names, Happy Mary, a story of entry, a story of freedom, the story of struggle. And this project, in a certain way, is that kind of invitation, people to think about this. And we're fortunate to do that. But I want to conclude with a couple of images. You see what's happening with names? For example, look at this. This name in French is the tender family, slave ship. The friends, les amis, slave ship. And inscribed in the glass, there's a kind of almost like a line of text that includes the word liberté, freedom, in 47 different languages that were touched by slavery and slave trade. And you can see what happens with the glass, and what happens with the materials when it rains. And there's a small information area where the traffic is shown, but a line that tells us still today the story is present. It is important to consider that this project is not only a vehicle, an instrument, but it's a place where we can think about ourselves. Because the I of I have a dream that we may remember, because you heard Martin Luther King, who heard that? Remember, I have a dream, well, it's I, myself, I have a dream. And that word demands from us not to stop the struggle to make a better world. Because to make a better world, make a better world is a grand et belle cause. Because to resist and to revolt, as you've done here, is important. Because to abolish all forms of slavery is key. Because dogs also participate in this. So let me conclude with this. The high tide, the water, and the view from the Palace of Justice. And I want to show you two images and then I'll conclude. First thing, whenever we work on memory and memorials, I think that our task is to shed light onto the past, but to understand that at the moment we do that, the past sheds a light on us and demands from us a response. Ethical response, as Levinas would have said, that suggests we have to do something for our present. As architects, activists, artists, political theorists, you name it, business people, people who clean our streets, anybody, we need to make the world better. That's what we try to do. Because, in a certain way, we look at the Palace of Justice from inside the memorial, but now we're looking at the memorial from the Palace of Justice. Which means that justice has not been done yet for many people. And that is part of this project, because we hope this project will elicit responsibility, will invite responsibility. And that word is very interesting because it means responsibility. That is the ability to respond. And we'd like to think that this project invites that. The second thing that I want to caution all of us, is to understand that when we conceive these monuments and memorials, we should be aware of the risks that they have. For example, objectivation of memory, aestheticization of suffering, or worse. But these are risks that we still should run, because we should do it with care and respect, because memory should not be immersed only inside, but should be affirmed as an action in the public sphere. That is, aesthetics should be at the service of ethics. And let me conclude with Levinas, and leave you with a couple of images here. Find the one that I was looking for. Let me leave you with this moment. A moment in which a woman of African descent or Caribbean descent was reading quite emotionally in this space. A moment in which justice still needs to be done. And a moment in which, and I want to share this image with you, I saw this happen. I was there last July with my two sons, and I spent 4 or 5 days just observing people in the memorial. And I decided, and I asked the docents that guided the tours, who knew who I was, please don't tell anybody that I'm here. Not because I didn't want to explain people, but because actually I didn't want to interfere with their experience. For me, it was observing what people do here that was important. And at this moment, what was very significant was that I saw the same woman with her son, who comes from kind of a mixed race, black and white, let's say, very emotionally connected. And for me, this is what is interesting, because space can invite that kind of emotions, those kinds of emotions. But the emotional response is not enough for me. The emotional response is important because it creates empathy, but what is important is then the action after that emotional response. That's why we wanted this space to be empty of images, empty of references, except the declaration and space that invites you to think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian, for such a compelling talk. It's been a pleasure listening to your lecture once again, and especially in this context when we are discussing how to remember certain things and how to remember things, particular things of our traumatic history, and how to and how to create spaces for those things that wouldn't fall into representation, but could create spaces beyond the spaces, and could create, as also you suggested, could create those forms that are beyond representation of trauma, as to avoid this moment of usurping. For me, what is really interesting and in a way problematic here, and something that I would like to invite also audience to think about and together with us, is this moment of disruption, because it is really a very strong gesture that through the design you are proposing. Well, of course, maybe I'm in a way trivializing, like, you know, all this complex project into one gesture. Probably there are more gestures than that. You can think about gesture framing as well, gesture framing certain space of and space for thinking. The empty space, the space that is under, the space that is filled with air, and the space that is filled with humidity, with the close proximity of the river. Julian probably didn't mention one detail, that the memorial is also very actively engages time. Very actively engages time, and also this time is manifested through several aspects. One of those is the tide that is happening. Well, not only once a day, twice a day, but also you mentioned that there is a protected layer, there is a protected barrier that that was initially thought to allow the tide to come into the space once a year, right? But then in the discussion it was developed that only maybe every once 10 years the tide would come in. It is connected as well with kind of like with the labor that is needed for kind of like cleaning space and so on. But this presence, you know, this presence to the this presence to more kind of like immaterial materials, you know, the presence, the close proximity to those immaterial materials that activate the senses of the body. It's a very important part of this memorial that may be not even possible to capture through the images. Right? You need to be there to experience humidity, to breathe in, you know, to your lungs, kind of like, you know, that kind of like, you know, tough air, that kind of like compressed air, right? And to be in the close proximity with this mass of water, which is protected with a thin layer of concrete, and to see the mist accumulating or the humidity accumulating on the glass. So those kind of like immaterial matters which are happening in the space, which are enacted in the space, with the help of framing, of, you know, through the assistance of the physical materials, of the material materials. Right? So next to this framing, right? And let me get back to this kind of like, you know, this first, the Thomas is asking me to stand up.
That was the draft.
No, Julian, please. You can understand. So let me to get back now to this powerful gesture of disruption, right? Disruption, as it was suggested, kind of like in the drawings, and then realized, you know, the disruption that is also reflects and suggests certain practices. practices that maybe, to borrow from Dessertor, may relate to more maybe tactical than strategic, right? And we know that, creative disruptions or disruptions, right, are certain tactics of artists rather than architects. Again, we have a lot of shared experience and exchange with Julian, as he is a very active participant in seminars at MIT, at Harvard as well, and we're meeting in also in the reviews, right, where we're discussing work of our students, and also. Next to those, I also wanted to mention our collaboration in making and producing Disobedience Archive. And I probably will be a little bit disobedience as well today. So I may go over the time, I don't know how much time I'm giving to speak. Why I'm mentioning these practices and these collaborations, and also in the frame of Disobedience Archive, is that these practices are maybe more dealing with kind of like tactical responses, right? Tactical responses that are more maybe ephemeral, more performative, and they work with materials that evaporate, right? Materials that are not maybe permanent materials, right? Maybe they are unfolding in time and space, as projections of sound and image, as gestures of body, and as gestures of certain, let's say, matters, that we could, consider as immaterial matters. And here for me it is really interesting paradox, and this paradox probably is also a paradox of artwork and of public space, because we can, let me to suggest that every good artwork is a public space, when I look at this work, I would like also to borrow this, model of artwork as it's suggested by Jacques Rancière, French philosopher, who says that every artwork should have these two sides, right? One side, or one foot, that is standing in the autonomy, right? And the other foot that is standing in the utility. So it is a paradox. It is a paradox that you have 2 feet. One is that is based on kind of like certain aesthetics that claim the autonomy, and the other one is a utility in a sense that it is inviting. It produces certain purpose. It calls for a certain purpose that does something for the society, that does something for the community, that does something by involving others into that work, into that heritage. So, and why this paradox? Because in a way, the good artwork always combines these two sides. So, I don't know, maybe it is this kind of like paradox, right, that we can deploy in thinking about disruption, which is in this memorial. And for me here, it is interesting also to think about this inevitable character of the of every architectural piece, right? Of every architectural piece, that it is in a way it is staying for a long time, right? It is staying for a long time. I don't know what is the lifetime of this memorial, but the disruptive action in the space, either through the visual or sound projection, we can instantly removed, right? It stays in the archive, it stays in our memories. It stays as important image that can be, distributed through the networks, through the media. Most importantly, it stays in our memories, of this experience. The architectural space that is framed, right? It's staying there forever. We can say forever. We can say for a long time, right? So for me, what is interesting in this disruptive gesture, that it combines both. It combines the tactical, the momentary, something that is happening instantly, and something that is kind of like contradicts that, right? By insisting on this kind of like on certain eternity, on certain continuity. So this is something that I would like maybe you, Julian, to consider, and maybe if you could help us to think about now and unfold this.
Okay. So let me say again, thanks for taking the time, of your day to be here. And I'd like to mention 2 or 3 words that connect to what Gediminas was saying, and I'll do it in 2 ways. On the one hand, Gediminas, you were talking about time at the beginning, and there's an aspect of time that is very specifically connected to spatial practices. This project, in a certain way, invites. People go with bikes and just keep going in the city. Remember what I showed you about the banner in my university and the coffee shop? People go here and walk the dog, and people go here and cross with bikes, and it's part of the city. It's part of the city, part of the daily life of the city. To me, what is interesting about that part is that there is a connectivity between daily life and moments of interruption. It's not that we remove the memorials from the city so that we go somewhere to commemorate something or to think about something. Memory happens. That's one issue. The second issue is that the fact that this is so long, it invites a long time for discovery. As I showed you in some of the photos, but you have not seen it, it takes an enormous amount of time to be there. I'll help you with some images that will somehow contribute to this clarification. Look at this image, look at this image, and look at this image. People are here in search of something. And here's what I want to show and explain the relation between time and something that we discovered happened here in this memorial that I did not know it would happen. I had an intuition, I had a sense that it could be the case, but I really did not know. Let me see, this is... You see, that moment in which you start to move, as you saw the people trying to find the angle to read, delays the process. And this is where I'm trying to unfold, connected to what you said about walking the city, the Chertow's essay and all that, which is this. When you walk, I'm sure you were taught to walk this way. I don't do that, But you probably remember, no, your parents or someone told you, no, walk straight, You walk straight, you're higher. Your point of view is higher. But something happens when you start looking at the ground this way. It happens physically. It happens emotionally. You do that. You turn around. You kneel. You take a photo. And that delays your process. And you begin to feel your feet in a very different way. Sensibility in public space happens through our feet, not only what you're bombarded with images. So this material, in a certain way, invites you to do these kinds of things spatially. That delays your process of staying there, or expands, let's put it this way, the time of your visit to this memorial, because you search and you see something else every time you're there. Even if it's the first time, you cannot read or you can read. That's one issue that interrupts your normal walking. It's very subtle but very powerful, because there are 2,000 of these. So if you read every one of them, you would spend 2 days or more. And then you go underground, and you will find yourself again confronted with another aspect of time. Let's see if this is. Same one. Inhabited. But this is what I wanted to show you. And that connects to the process of time, which is also amplified by the project of sound that exists in space. But look at this woman. Still reading. People take that time. And the material quality is what is helping you do that. So the disruption of the glass